On the northern high plains, a documented heat wave in the summer of 1886 pushed 4th of July temperatures at Dickinson toward 112 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet the town still held a full parade in the open sun. Across what would become western North Dakota, July is typically the warmest month of the year, with average temperatures around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and frequent days well into the 80s and 90s. Inside a plank-walled summer kitchen with a cast-iron range firing for bread, coffee, and canning, head-height air could easily rise tens of degrees above shade temperature. Most farms answered with the same solutions: detach the kitchen, open every door and window, and stand in their own heat. A minority built something different: a second wall behind the stove, a narrow slot of open air, and a vent path straight to the roof. This account examines one such fool's air gap in technical, period-accurate terms, and how a few inches of moving air did more cooling work than many extra hours of fuel. Flies ticked against a screen frame, while a cast-iron range ran at baking temperature. Flour dust clinging to damp boards in the close air. July on the northern Dakota Territory homesteads within a day's ride of Dickinson meant work that could not wait. The range had been lit at 4:30 that morning for coffee and breakfast. By 10 o'clock, with bread rising and the first batch of preserves bubbling, the thermometer nailed to the wall post already read 94 degrees Fahrenheit at head height, 8 degrees above the shade temperature outside. Climate records for the region show July as the warmest month, with mean temperatures near 70 degrees Fahrenheit and documented extremes above 100 degrees. The summer of 1886 produced some of the highest readings on record, with multiple days exceeding 100 degrees across the northern plains. Inside a detached summer kitchen, a small outbuilding designed specifically to keep cooking heat away from the main house, conditions were far more severe. The typical summer kitchen on a quarter-section claim measured 12 by 14 feet, or 14 by 16 feet. Construction followed light framing or small log methods, plank or puncheon floor, walls of vertical or horizontal boards over studs, gable roof with 7 to 8 foot ceiling height. 1 or 2 windows provided cross ventilation when wind cooperated. A simple door opened to the yard. The cast-iron range sat near an exterior wall, sharing a chimney or venting through a separate stovepipe that pierced the roof. This arrangement reflected Pennsylvania German and Midwestern practice that had migrated west with settlers. Period descriptions and museum interpretive material define the summer kitchen as a separate building used in hot months to keep heat and smell out of the main dwelling. The logic was sound. Confine cooking operations to a dedicated space, protect the Iuyas primary residents from fire risk and oppressive warmth, and limit the spread of smoke and food odors through living quarters. Operating loads during July and August were substantial. Breakfast required a hot stove. The midday meal often involved baking or reheating. On wash days and during the canning season, when garden produce came in waves that could not be delayed, the range ran 6 to 10 hours continuously. Fuel came from local woodcut and hauled from creek-bottom stands of cottonwood and elm, sometimes supplemented by purchased coal or lignite as rail service expanded across the territory. The summer kitchen solved one problem: it kept the main house cooler, but it created another that went largely unaddressed in pattern books and farm bulletins. The cook stood in the hottest, least ventilated space on the entire property. Thin walls and a low, uninsulated roof concentrated heat. The stove radiated warmth in all directions. The backing wall absorbed and re-radiated that energy into the room. Hot air rose to the ceiling and pooled under the roof boards, creating a stratified thermal environment where head and chest were consistently in the warmest layer. By mid-afternoon on a hot day, with the range running for canning, interior temperatures could reach 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The person working at the stove, typically a woman managing food preservation that would carry the household through winter. faced hours of sustained exposure to heat that exceeded safe working thresholds recognized even in that era. Medical and agricultural bulletins warned about heat exhaustion and advised rest in cooler spaces, but the work had to be done when the vegetables ripened and the fruit came ripe. The same outbuilding meant to keep houses cooler was now the hottest, least efficient room on the place. Coal oil and flour entries spaced like clockwork in a general store ledger, stove bolts and stovepipe elbows listed nearby, penciled against familiar farm names in careful script. The logistics of keeping a summer kitchen running touched every aspect of homestead economy. Flour, sugar, and coal moved by rail to depots, then by wagon to individual farms, often 50 to 150 miles from the nearest railhead. Prices reflected transport costs and store credit terms, marked up at each stage. Fuel represented a constant demand. Wood for cooking had to be cut, hauled, split, and stacked. A cord of cottonwood or elm, 8 feet long, 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, might last a household several weeks during heavy summer cooking, longer if used sparingly. Families cut what they could from timber along creeks and in draws, hauling logs by wagon over rough ground. When local wood ran short, purchased coal became an option where rail service reached. North Dakota's emerging lignite deposits provided low-grade fuel, but hauling and storage added to the burden. Store ledgers from the period show regular entries for cook stoves and related hardware. Common ranges of the 1880s featured cast-iron fireboxes 12 to 18 inches wide, with 4 to 6 cooking surfaces on top and an oven compartment below. Surface area on a working range could exceed 6 square feet of radiating iron. Manufacturers recommended clearances of 12 to 18 inches from combustible walls, though photographs and insurance surveys show stoves pushed closer to gain working space. In a typical summer kitchen, the range sat close to an exterior wall, often with minimal masonry or metal shielding behind it. The firebox remained at near constant temperature during active cooking, 600 to 700 degrees Fahrenheit for bread baking, sustained at 400 to 500 degrees for simmering and preserving work. That heat radiated outward in all directions, upward into pots and kettles, laterally into the room, and backward toward the wall. The backing wall absorbed thermal energy through conduction and radiation. Boards and studs heated up, then re-radiated warmth back into the kitchen. Rising hot air created a convective plume that spread across the ceiling, heating roof boards that in turn radiated downward. The cook stood in the intersection of multiple heat sources: direct radiation from the stove, reflected radiation from the backing wall, and the hot air layer descending from the ceiling. Stove duty cycles during harvest and preserving season were punishing. Morning fires lit at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning for coffee and breakfast. Midday baking or reheating added hours. Afternoon and evening canning sessions on heavy production days kept the range hot into late evening. A conservative estimate for a busy week in late July or early August might total 40 to 50 hours of active firing, spread across 6 or 7 days. Heat flow in plain terms. Every hour of stove operation added thermal energy to the room faster than natural ventilation could remove it. Thin plank walls offered minimal insulation. Opening doors and windows helped when wind moved air through, but on still, hot days, common on the high plains in summer, convection alone could not clear the accumulated heat. Human impact showed in work patterns. Tasks were postponed to cooler morning or evening hours when possible. Some canning moved to night with attendant risks of fatigue and poor visibility. Families learned to space heavy cooking days to allow recovery, but seasonal imperatives, vegetables ripening, fruit peaking, often forced consecutive long days at the range. Every extra hour of burn time showed up twice, in the ledger as fuel expense and in the kitchen as degrees and fatigue. A whitewashed brick summer kitchen on an older farm back east, shuttered for winter, its chimneys scarred by years of smoke, represented a building type with deep roots. The practice of detaching kitchens from main dwellings stretched back through the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in mid-Atlantic and southern regions. Pennsylvania German farmsteads routinely included separate bakehouses and summer kitchens. Virginia plantations built detached kitchen structures as standard practice. Heritage tours and popular writing often emphasize fire risk mitigation as the primary reason for separation. The logic is straightforward. Cooking fires in close quarters posed genuine danger to wooden structures. A kitchen fire that started in a detached building might burn that structure without threatening the main house. Insurance considerations and practical safety made separation attractive, but period accounts reveal broader motivations. Household manuals and farm correspondence reference keeping main houses cooler and sweeter, meaning fresher smelling. Heavy cooking generated smoke, steam, food odors, and heat. Butchering, washing, and canning produced smells and waste that families preferred to keep away from living quarters. Moving these operations to a separate building improved conditions in the dwelling, especially during hot months. The persistent problem, even when detached, the kitchen itself remained a hot room. Solid walls, whether brick, log, or plank, enclosed the space. Limited openings restricted airflow. Low ceilings concentrated heat near working height. Stoves radiated in all directions, and backing walls absorbed and re-radiated thermal energy regardless of building location. Early hints of airflow thinking appear in occasional references within household manuals. Transom vents above doors, high windows to release rising hot air, and draft management in cooking spaces received mention. Some builders added cupolas or roof vents to barns and workshops. But structured exhaust for non-smoke heat in kitchens, treating the heated air itself as something to be managed and removed, appeared rarely in documented practice. The contrast was clear. Separation protected the parlor. The worker in the kitchen saw little improvement when weather was still and air stagnated. Opening doors and windows helped when wind provided natural ventilation. On calm days, common during high plains, summer high-pressure systems, convection alone moved air slowly. The cook stood in a hot box, whether that box was attached to the house or standing 20 feet away. Farm bulletins and extension materials from the late 19th and early 20th centuries focused on kitchen arrangement, work surface heights, and storage layouts. Discussion of thermal comfort centered on window placement, shade trees, and screened porches. The physics of how walls and ceilings handled radiant heat received minimal attention outside engineering and industrial contexts. Frontier builders absorbed the idea, put the kitchen in its own box. The form was established, carried west with settlers, and adapted to available materials. Plank frame construction replaced brick in timber-scarce regions. Dimensions shrank to fit homestead scales and budgets. But the basic template, a small enclosed space with a stove near one wall, persisted. The underlying physics inside those walls had barely been questioned. Heat moved according to established laws. Conduction, convection, radiation. Stoves generated thermal energy. Walls and ceilings absorbed and re-radiated it. Air rose and pooled where structure trapped it. These behaviors occurred whether the builder understood them or not. By the time summer kitchens reached the northern plains, the form was established, but the physics inside the walls had barely been questioned. A board pulled from a wall behind an old range showed heat-darkened knots and faint scorch marks near nailheads where metal had conducted extra warmth into wood. This piece of evidence illustrated the thermal environment behind every frontier cook stove. Sustained heat exposure that degraded materials over time and signaled the intensity of energy flowing through the backing structure. Construction details of typical rural summer kitchens from the 1870s through 1890s followed simple patterns. Outer skin consisted of 3/4 inch to 1 inch boards, arranged horizontally or vertically, sometimes finished with clapboard siding. Framing used 2x4 studs or small poles spaced 16 to 24 inches on center. The inner face might be left as bare studs or covered with rough boards. In some cases, a thin brick panel or sheet metal served as a stove shield immediately behind the range. Range placement varied by available space and builder preference. Stove manufacturers recommended clearances of 12 to 18 inches or more from combustible walls. Reality often differed. Photographs and insurance inspection reports show stoves pushed closer to walls to maximize working room in tight quarters. Shared flues with the main house or small separate chimneys pierced the roof above the range. Heat behavior in this configuration followed predictable paths. Conduction carried thermal energy through backing boards and studs into the outer skin, warming the exterior wall surface. Radiation from the stove heated the backing wall directly, raising surface temperatures that then radiated heat back into the room. The space behind the stove, often just a few inches, became a stagnant pocket of hot air with minimal circulation. Safety measures adopted to prevent fire sometimes exacerbated the heat problem. Tin sheets or thin brick panels reduced the risk of direct contact ignition, but metal conducted heat efficiently and brick absorbed and stored thermal energy. These barriers prevented charring but did not address overall room temperature. In fact, they created more efficient thermal mass, surfaces that stayed hot long after the fire was drawn. The backing wall ceased to be merely a physical barrier. It became an active component of the thermal system, absorbing energy during cooking cycles and re-radiating that energy into the workspace for hours afterward. On a heavy canning day, the wall behind the stove might remain warm to the touch well into the night, even when the range had been cold for hours. Clearances recommended by manufacturers addressed fire risk but ignored thermal comfort. A stove set 18 inches from a wall still radiated effectively to that surface. The air gap provided no benefit if it was not connected to deliberate airflow paths. Dead air trapped behind a stove insulated poorly. Air conducts heat when it cannot move to carry energy away through convection. Insurance inspection notes from the period document fire hazards in frontier kitchens: inadequate clearances, combustible materials too close to stoves, improper chimney construction. These inspections focused on preventing structural fires. They did not address the working conditions of the person spending hours at the range. By treating the backing wall solely as a fire problem, builders accidentally turned it into an efficient radiant panel, feeding heat back into the cook's space. A hand pressed to the underside of a roof board near the ridge came away dusty and warm, hours after the fire was banked and the stove sat cold. This simple test revealed the persistence of heat in the upper reaches of a summer kitchen. Thermal energy that rose from the range spread across the ceiling and remained trapped by structure and still air. Geometry and volume in typical summer kitchens created conditions that concentrated heat at head height. Common ceiling height of 7 to 8 feet over a 12 by 14 foot footprint meant roughly 1,200 cubic feet of interior volume. The stove and backing wall occupied one corner or wall section. Hot air rising from these surfaces formed a plume that reached the ceiling within seconds, then spread laterally under the roof boards. Single-skin roof construction, boards laid directly over rafters with shingles above and no insulation, provided minimal thermal resistance. On a hot day, the roof absorbed solar radiation from above while receiving convective and radiant heat from below. Roof surface temperatures could reach 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sun. Interior ceiling surfaces heated by trapped air and conducting warmth from the sun-baked roof stayed elevated for hours. Air patterns followed predictable physics. Hot air from the stove and backing wall rose to the peak, displacing cooler air downward along the outer walls. In a sealed or poorly ventilated space, this circulation stalled. The hottest layer pooled at the ceiling. With limited high-level outlets, that hot air had nowhere to go. It remained aloft, radiating downward toward the workspace and maintaining elevated temperatures long after active cooking ceased. Weather Bureau records and later climatological summaries show that the northern plains experienced multi-day runs of high temperatures during summer months. Fargo, North Dakota, recorded average July highs in the low 80s Fahrenheit with frequent excursions into the 90s. Heat waves, defined as consecutive days above specific thresholds, occurred regularly. Agricultural bulletins from the period warned about heat exhaustion in field workers and advised rest in shaded or cooler spaces. Inside a summer kitchen during such a heat wave, conditions compounded. Outdoor temperatures in the mid-90s meant baseline interior temperatures started high. Add a working stove, and head height air could reach 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The ceiling, heated from below and above, became a secondary radiator, extending the time the kitchen remained dangerously hot. The cook's head and chest, positioned 4.5 to 5 feet above the floor, resided in the warmest thermal zone. Breathing elevated temperature air increased respiratory stress. Radiant heat from above added to the direct load from the stove. Any food stored on high shelves or near rafters faced higher ambient temperatures, accelerating spoilage in jars and dry goods. Opening doors and low windows helped at body level when wind moved air through. But on windless days, the hot layer trapped under the roof persisted. Convection alone, without deliberate paths for air to exit at high points, could not clear the accumulated heat. In many summer kitchens, the hottest surface wasn't the stove or even the wall, it was the overhead boards no one thought to redesign. An engraving of a range cutaway printed in a manufacturer's catalog showed hollow spaces and baffles inside the iron shell, features deliberately designed to control heat distribution and improve cooking performance. These internal air spaces represented a mature understanding that trapped air could moderate temperature, redirect heat flow, and protect outer surfaces from excessive temperatures. Double-wall concepts appeared in 19th century stove and oven development across the United States and Europe. Ovens featured an outer casting and inner lining separated by an air gap, reducing exterior surface temperature and creating more even baking environments. Stoves advertised cooler sides thanks to internal air chambers that insulated the outer shell from direct firebox heat. Patent records from the 1850s through 1880s document these designs explicitly. Chimney and hearth construction showed similar sophistication. Some masonry heaters and ovens incorporated voids or multiple flues, using gas paths and dead air spaces to shape heat release over time. Russian and Scandinavian stove designs, brought to North America by immigrants, featured massive masonry structures with complex internal channels that captured and released heat slowly, maintaining warmth for hours after firing ceased. Recognized benefits included reduced risk of contact burns, more predictable baking temperatures, and improved fuel efficiency. Manufacturers understood that controlling heat paths within an appliance improved performance and safety. Range manuals recommended clearances and shield constructions that relied on air layers to protect combustible wall materials. Patent language reveals this knowledge explicitly. Applications specified air spaces, ventilated casings, and insulating voids as design features. Technical papers discussed heat transfer through gases, the insulating properties of still air, and the benefits of separating hot surfaces from cooler ones with intentional gaps. The physical understanding existed. A layer of air, properly managed, could slow heat transfer or redirect it along useful paths. Appliance makers applied this knowledge routinely. Iron foundries built air gaps into stove designs as standard practice. Masons incorporated voids into heater and oven construction. Yet cabin carpentry and light frame building practice rarely extended these principles to wall construction. Walls were treated as solid barriers, load-bearing structures that enclose space and shed weather. The idea that a wall could include an active thermal component, using air as a working material rather than empty space, appeared infrequently in pattern books and building manuals. The gap between appliance engineering and building practice was organizational, not technical. Stove designers thought about heat management because their products generated concentrated thermal energy. Builders thought about structure, weather tightness, and cost. The two domains overlapped minimally. Some exceptions existed. Double-wall construction in cold climate buildings used trapped air for insulation. Barn designs incorporated ventilated attic spaces to manage hay moisture and temperature. Industrial buildings sometimes featured ventilated walls to exhaust heat from machinery. But these examples remain specialized, not routine. The frontier had access to stoves built on air gap thinking, marketed with explicit claims about how internal voids improved performance. That same frontier built kitchens where the most punishing heat poured through solid wood walls, unmanaged and unvented. The knowledge existed. The tools existed. The gap was not in understanding physics, but in applying that understanding outside the iron shell of the appliance itself. The frontier had access to stoves built on air gap thinking, yet the most punishing heat in a summer kitchen still poured through a solid wood wall. Chalk lines on a floor marking two parallel walls in the stove corner, where most cabins had only one, signaled a departure from standard practice. This detail, an inner stove wall framed a few inches inside the exterior wall line, defined the fool's air gap design, a deliberate cavity intended to capture and export heat rising from the range. Layout followed simple geometry. The outer wall remained the weather skin tied to the roof structure and foundation as in conventional construction. The inner wall stood as a separate framed partition, creating a continuous vertical cavity behind the stove zone. Dimension of the cavity mattered. Too narrow and airflow would be restricted. Too wide and material costs and lost interior space became prohibitive. Practical cavity widths ranged from 2 to 4 inches, enough for air to move vertically without obstruction, small enough to frame with standard studs and nailing techniques. The inner face might be finished with boards or, in some cases, thin brick for added fire protection and thermal mass. The outer face retained standard cladding, horizontal or vertical boards, finished to match the rest of the building. Height of the cavity ran from just above floor level to near the ceiling or top plate, approximately 7 feet in a typical summer kitchen. This created a vertical duct that connected low and high points in the room, enabling natural convection. Lower openings admitted room air behind the stove, protected with fine mesh to exclude vermin and embers. Upper openings connected to a vented chase or exhausted directly to eaves, with screened outlets to prevent insect entry and rain penetration. Labor and material costs exceeded standard single-wall construction. Extra studs for the inner partition, additional boards for both faces of the cavity, more nails and fasteners, and careful detailing at openings added time and expense. For a single wall section approximately 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, the cavity wall required perhaps 50% more framing lumber and an extra day or two of carpentry. Modern building science provides quantitative support for this approach. Studies on ventilated cavities and rain screen claddings, common in contemporary construction, show significant reductions in heat transfer when gaps are properly vented. Air moving through a cavity carries away thermal energy that would otherwise conduct through solid walls. Test data from facade studies document temperature drops of 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit on interior wall surfaces when cavities are open and actively vented compared to sealed assemblies. The principle is straightforward. A moving column of air acts as a conveyor, picking up heat from the warm inner surface and exhausting it outdoors before it can radiate into the room. The wall ceases to be a passive mass and becomes a vertical duct, deliberately capturing and removing thermal energy. This required no new technology. Studs, boards, nails, and simple vents could be fabricated with hand tools. Mesh for screens was available from general stores. The only requirement beyond materials was the decision to allocate space to air, to treat the cavity not as wasted volume but as a working system. Builders accustomed to maximizing usable floor area and storage space saw the cavity as inefficient. It added nothing you could set a pot on or hang a tool from. It consumed lumber and labor for no visible return. On paper, the added wall buys nothing you can see from the yard. In practice, it buys a different temperature at the cook's face. A simple mercury thermometer nailed to a post with pencil marks at eye height showing past readings represented the shift from guesswork to measurement. Frontier households had access to basic thermometers by the 1880s, inexpensive instruments adequate for tracking indoor and outdoor temperatures. Using one systematically turned subjective comfort complaints into objective data. Measurement routines, reconstructed from common practice, followed straightforward patterns. Outside shade temperature recorded near dawn, at noon, and in late afternoon established baseline conditions. Indoor readings taken at stove-side, mid-room, and just under the rafters mapped the thermal environment across height and distance. Same-day comparisons required consistent stove loads, bread baking at predictable times, coffee kept warm, canning cycles run on similar schedules. Translating modern building science data into frontier context requires care but provides essential support. Contemporary studies of ventilated wall systems measure interior surface temperatures under controlled conditions. Results consistently show reductions of 15 to 30% in surface temperature when cavities are vented compared to sealed assemblies. Applied to a summer kitchen scenario, this translates to potential drops of 5 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit at interior surfaces near the stove during heavy firing. Room air temperature depends on more variables: volume, ventilation, outdoor conditions, and stove output. But directional effects hold. If the backing wall runs cooler due to cavity venting, radiant heat into the workspace decreases proportionally. If hot air is exhausted continuously through upper cavity vents, the ceiling and rafter zone accumulates less thermal energy. A comparative day might unfold as follows. Outside conditions identical. 90 degrees Fahrenheit maximum, light wind, clear sky. Two kitchens, same footprint and stove model, run identical firing schedules. Bread in the morning, simmering for preserves midday, final baking in late afternoon. Standard wall kitchen peaks at 108 degrees Fahrenheit at head height during afternoon baking, with ceiling temperatures higher. The cavity-backed version peaks at 100 degrees to 102 degrees Fahrenheit at the same measurement point and cools faster once the fire is drawn. The difference, 6 to 8 degrees, might seem modest in absolute terms. But at elevated baseline temperatures, small reductions in peak exposure and faster cool-down rates compound into substantial improvements in working conditions. Heat stress thresholds are not linear. The body's ability to regulate core temperature degrades rapidly above certain ambient conditions. A few degrees can mean the difference between completing a task and being forced to stop. Limits and trade-offs existed. The cavity did not eliminate heat. It reduced peak exposure and shortened duration above critical thresholds. Benefit was greatest on calm, hot days when natural convection dominated and wind-driven ventilation was absent. In cooler weather or with strong cross breezes, the cavity's advantage diminished. It was not a universal solution, but a targeted intervention for the most punishing conditions. Fuel use might show modest reductions over a season. With cooler backing walls and less heat accumulation, stoves could be drawn sooner after cooking tasks were complete. Less idling to maintain working temperatures in an overheated space meant fewer sticks of wood burned per day. Cumulative savings over a summer of heavy cooking could reach half a cord, days of labor saved in cutting and hauling. In the log of temperatures and hours fired, the only consistent difference between two summers is a slice of air no wider than a man's hand. A page from a weather table listed a run of high 80s and 90s days with no break in sight, temperatures that defined a true test season for any summer kitchen. Northern Plains climate records document such sequences. July of 1886 saw extended periods of extreme heat across Dakota Territory, with multiple stations recording highs above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These heat waves, while not annual, occurred frequently enough that design decisions had to account for sustained thermal stress. Scenario comparison requires holding variables constant. Two summer kitchens, similar footprints, same stove models, comparable workloads. Both run morning bread baking starting at 5 o'clock, midday simmering for preserves, and evening canning cycles during a 2-week peak harvest period. Outside conditions track historical records: consecutive days with highs in the low to mid-90s, overnight lows in the 60s, light and variable winds. Daily temperature patterns in the standard kitchen followed predictable arcs. Morning climb as the stove was lit, from overnight ambient of 70 degrees Fahrenheit to 95 degrees by 8 o'clock at head height. Midday sustained plateau, 100 to 105 degrees during peak firing, with ceiling temperatures 5 to 10 degrees higher. Evening decay, slow drop after the fire was banked, still above 90 degrees at midnight when outdoor temperature had fallen to 65 degrees. The cavity-backed kitchen showed different behavior. Morning climb remained similar. Stove output dominated in the first hours. But midday peaks reached only 98 to 100 degrees at head height, and the hot layer under the ceiling stayed cooler throughout. Evening decay was faster. Continuous venting through upper cavity openings carried residual heat out, bringing interior temperature below 85 degrees by 10 o'clock. The shocking number emerged from cumulative hours analysis. Over a 2-week canning stretch, 14 consecutive days of heavy stove use, the standard kitchen accumulated approximately 140 hours above 95 degrees Fahrenheit at working height. The cavity-cooled kitchen, under identical outdoor conditions and workloads, accumulated approximately 90 hours above the same threshold. Reduction, roughly 1/3. Consequences for the person at the stove were direct. Fewer hours in extreme heat meant reduced physiological stress. Heat exhaustion risk dropped. Work could proceed at normal pace rather than requiring frequent breaks or postponement to night hours. The cumulative fatigue over 2 weeks, normally enough to degrade health and slow task completion, was measurably less severe. Secondary effects included improved food safety margins. Preserves processed at lower ambient temperatures had better odds of proper sealing and sterilization. High storage temperatures accelerated spoilage. Even modest reductions extended shelf life. Dry goods stored near the ceiling or in adjacent pantry spaces faced less thermal stress. Medical and agricultural bulletins from the period provide context for these numbers. Recommendations for safe working conditions in hot environments suggested limiting exposure above certain wet bulb temperatures, a measure combining heat and humidity. While frontier kitchens lacked sophisticated instrumentation, experiential knowledge aligned with these thresholds. Workers knew when conditions became unbearable. The cavity wall moved that breaking point farther out. The test season also revealed operational simplicity. Opening lower and upper cavity vents required minimal effort, removing mesh covers or sliding simple dampers. No complex mechanisms, no maintenance beyond ensuring outlets stayed clear. The system worked passively, driven by temperature difference and natural convection. Against the same heat wave, the only kitchen that stayed workable was the one with wasted space behind the stove. A carpenter's sketch on scrapboard showed a standard corner, and beside it, a homeowner's request for an extra wall behind the stove, with rough dimensions and a question mark over the cavity width. This fragment captured the perception gap that slowed adoption of cavity wall designs. Builders trained to value every inch of usable space saw the air gap as inefficient, a luxury that consumed materials for no visible return. The objection was reasonable from a traditional building perspective. Interior square footage determined how much could be stored, how many people could work comfortably, and how efficiently the space functioned. Sacrificing several inches along one wall reduced already tight dimensions. Extra framing required more lumber, more labor, and more complex detailing at joints and openings. Pattern books and farm bulletins showed no examples of such construction. The cavity did not appear in standard plans. Practical concerns extended beyond first cost. Unseen cavities raised fears of hidden rot if moisture penetrated, or vermin. Nesting in spaces that could not be inspected easily. Flashing and weather sealing required extra care. Trim work at openings and corners became more complicated. For a builder accustomed to fast, straightforward construction, the cavity wall represented unnecessary complication. But reframing the discussion through performance data shifted the equation. When temperature logs and fuel records were compared side by side, the cavity kitchen showed better comfort for similar or slightly reduced fuel use. The modest savings came from shorter firing times, less need to keep the stove hot to overcome a persistently overheated room. Over a decade of operation, this translated to meaningful reductions in wood cutting and hauling. The wasted inches of cavity space could be quantified differently, as degrees of cooling capacity, as hours below heat stress thresholds, as cords of wood not burned. Expressed in these terms, the empty space became productive, a working system, not dead volume. Gradual adoption occurred through informal channels. A farmer who built a cavity-backed kitchen and logged measurably cooler conditions shared results with neighbors. A carpenter who framed one cavity wall and saw the homeowner's satisfaction incorporated the technique into later projects, sometimes in modified form. Word spread at community gatherings, through church groups, at Grange meetings. Evidence of wider adoption remains circumstantial. Few building plans from the period survive, and those that do reflect pattern book conventions, not field improvisations. Oral history references to double walls in hot workspaces appear occasionally in regional archives, but lack technical detail. The absence of documentation does not mean absence of practice. Frontier builders rarely recorded innovations that worked. Parallel developments in other contexts suggest the idea had legs. Ventilated barn designs managed hay moisture with controlled airflow. Workshop walls sometimes incorporated shielded gaps behind forges and heaters. South-facing walls in some structures used double skin assemblies to capture solar warmth in winter while venting excess heat in summer. These scattered examples shared a common principle. Air, properly managed, could do useful work. Modern building codes and standards now codify ventilated cavities for rain screen cladding, pressure-equalized facades, and thermal management. The waste became mainstream engineering, but in the 1880s on the northern plains, the idea had no name and no formal recognition, just scattered builders willing to run the numbers instead of the tape measure. For builders willing to run the numbers instead of the tape measure, the emptiest part of the wall turned out to be the most productive. First, hard frost on a water bucket outside. Inside, the range lit in the summer kitchen for butchering day, steam rising from scalding water. The cavity wall, designed for July heat, now faced a different operational context. Could a system built to exhaust heat function safely and effectively across seasons, or did it create new problems in cooler weather? Fire and smoke behavior required careful attention. The cavity acted as a secondary path for hot air, but was not designed to carry smoke or combustion gases. Proper screening at lower and upper openings was critical. Fine mesh excluded embers while allowing air passage. Sizing mattered. Openings large enough for effective airflow, but not so large that sparks or burning material could enter the cavity. Period fire safety guidance from insurance companies and stove manufacturers warned about concealed flues and hidden combustible spaces in timber structures. Cavities that accumulated creosote or allowed smoke infiltration became fire hazards. The cavity wall design avoided this risk by separating the vent path from the stove's combustion system. Only heated air entered the cavity. No flame, no smoke, no direct combustion products. Seasonal tuning offered operational flexibility. Simple shutters, sliding boards, or fitted panels could block lower and upper cavity openings in late autumn and winter. With vents closed, the airspace became a mostly sealed insulating layer, reducing heat loss from the room. This converted the summer cooling system into a winter thermal buffer, using the same structure in two modes. Reopening vents in spring restored summer function. The transition required no special tools or skills, just remembering to adjust openings as seasons changed. Farmers accustomed to seasonal maintenance routines, closing storm shutters, banking foundations, sealing doors, incorporated cavity vent adjustments into that rhythm. Multi-season performance data, reconstructed from building science principles, suggests the system remained beneficial year-round. In shoulder seasons, spring and fall, when cooking loads remained high but outdoor temperatures moderated, modest cavity airflow continued to protect backing wall woodwork from excessive heat without stripping too much warmth from the room. Winter operation with vents closed provided insulation comparable to a standard wall, while still offering the option to reopen vents during rare winter cooking marathons. Trade-offs existed. Slight complexity in operation, remembering to open and close vents at appropriate times, added a task to household management. Risk arose if vents were inadvertently left blocked during hot weather, negating all benefits. Proper seasonal adjustment required attention and discipline. But compared to the alternative, a standard wall that provided no thermal management in any season, the cavity wall offered flexibility. It adapted to changing needs without requiring structural modification. The same cavity that carried heat away in July could, with two shutters, stand down in January without creating problems. Modern building codes address concealed spaces with requirements for fire blocking, cavity, barriers at floor lines, and inspectable construction. These rules reflect accumulated knowledge about fire spread and moisture problems in wall cavities. The frontier cavity wall, built without formal codes, relied on builder judgment and material availability. When done carefully, with proper screening, limited cavity width, and seasonal attention, the system functioned safely. Documented failures are absent from the record, but absence of evidence is not evidence of safety. The small number of cavity-backed kitchens built, combined with sparse documentation, makes statistical assessment impossible. What can be said? The principle was sound, the execution straightforward, and the operational demands modest. The gap that carried heat away in July could, with two shutters, stand down in January without turning into a risk. A later farmhouse sectioned in a preservation report showed ventilated attic spaces, porch roofs with deliberate airflow paths, and, in one barn attachment, double-layer siding with air between courses. These features, documented in rural structures from the late 19th through mid-20th centuries, reflected a broader pattern, builders using controlled voids as part of thermal strategy, often without formal engineering guidance. Parallels to the cavity wall concept appeared across multiple building types. Screened porches, common on farmhouses by the early 1900s, provided shaded outdoor spaces with controlled airflow. Ventilated roofs, with ridge vents, soffit openings, or cupolas, managed attic heat and moisture, keeping upper floors cooler in summer. Double-boarded walls with air between layers appeared in barns, sheds, and workshops, sometimes for insulation, sometimes for drying grain or managing condensation. Cold roofs, assemblies that deliberately vented the space between roofing and insulation, became standard practice in snow country construction, preventing ice dams and reducing heat loss. The principle was identical to the cavity wall. Use moving air to carry away unwanted thermal energy before it affects interior conditions. Summer kitchens remained in use into the 20th century across the Midwest and Upper South. Photographs and preservation surveys document detached kitchen buildings with screened porches, high vents, and occasionally double-wall sections behind stoves or in full south-facing walls. Some incorporated louvered panels or adjustable shutters, allowing seasonal tuning of airflow. Tools and materials required for these systems remained consistent with frontier capability: hand saws, hammers, nails, basic framing lumber, and mesh screening. No manufactured products or specialized equipment were necessary beyond the decision to allocate space and labor to air management. Continuity with the air gap idea is suggestive rather than proven. Documentation connecting specific frontier innovations to later vernacular patterns is sparse. Oral history, where it exists, describes practices without attributing origins. Builders learned techniques from prior examples, adapted them to local conditions, and passed knowledge through apprenticeship and observation. What can be established? The physical principles that made cavity walls effective in 1880s summer kitchens remained valid in later applications. Ventilated assemblies reduced heat transfer. Controlled airflow managed moisture. Seasonal adjustment extended functionality. These benefits emerged from physics, not from awareness of earlier precedents. Preservation professionals studying rural architecture note persistent features that align with thermal management principles: layered assemblies, ventilated spaces, adjustable openings. These elements appear in buildings constructed over many decades across diverse regions by builders with varying levels of formal training. The pattern suggests widespread empirical understanding that air, properly managed, contributed to building performance. Modern codes and standards formalized what vernacular practice had discovered through trial and error. Rain screen cladding requirements in contemporary building codes mandate ventilated cavities behind siding, using the same convective principle as the frontier cavity wall. Energy codes specify ventilated attic assemblies. Facade engineering guides detail pressure-equalized cavities for moisture and thermal control. Long before rain screen entered codebooks, farmers were already building structures that worked on the same principle, without a name for it. A simple side-by-side table, 2 kitchens, same workload over 10 years, columns for fuel consumed, cumulative hours above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and estimated years of structural service before major maintenance. The numbers told the story without embellishment. Standard wall summer kitchen, approximately 60 cords of wood burned over a decade of heavy summer cooking, assuming 1.5 cords per season for 6-month cooking periods. Cumulative exposure above 95 degrees Fahrenheit at working height, roughly 700 hours per season, 7,000 hours over 10 years. Backing wall replacement or reboarding needed after 15 years due to heat degradation and moisture damage. Cavity-backed summer kitchen, approximately 55 cords over the same period, modest savings from shorter firing times and less idling. Cumulative exposure above 95 degrees, roughly 450 hours per season, 4,500 over 10 years, reduction of 35%. Backing wall and framing showed less thermal stress. Service life extended to 20-plus years before major work required. Estimated degree reductions at working height during peak conditions, 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, based on ventilated wall performance data applied to frontier geometry. This translated to measurably improved working conditions during the hottest weeks of the year, the weeks when canning and preserving could not be postponed. Human outcomes remained harder to quantify, but no less real. Fewer days lost or shortened due to heat exhaustion. More reliable completion of preserving schedules, improving food security through winter. Reduced long-term health impacts from sustained heat exposure, a factor difficult to measure but acknowledged in period medical literature discussing occupational heat stress. Connection to modern practice is direct. Ventilated facades, cavity walls, and cold roofs now appear in building codes worldwide. Performance data from contemporary research validates what scattered frontier builders discovered empirically. Properly vented air spaces significantly reduce heat transfer and improve building durability. The principle scales across eras and technologies. Whether the backing is split log planks or engineered panels, whether fasteners are hand-forged nails or pneumatic staples, the physics remains constant. A moving column of air picks up thermal energy and carries it away before it can degrade interior conditions. Frontier living rewarded those who treated air as a material to be shaped, not just empty space between boards. The successful homesteader understood that survival often depended on managing invisible flows: heat, moisture, wind. Building envelopes that acknowledged these flows, that worked with physical laws rather than ignoring them, lasted longer and performed better. The small decision to change a wall section altered both the thermal profile of a single room and the workday of the person who used it most. Over years, that decision compounded into measurable differences: less fuel burned, fewer hours in dangerous heat, longer building service life, more successful food preservation. In a climate where summers could bake and winters could kill, the lesson was clear. The most effective interventions often came not from adding mass or burning more fuel, but from letting physics do work that muscle and money could not. On the northern plains, one of the most effective insulators was not another inch of wood or brick, but a measured strip of moving air that never appeared on any freight bill. What choice would you have made? Build fast and standard, or invest the extra days in a cavity wall that promised cooler air but no proof? Share your thoughts in the comments. Practical Frontier stories keep this history alive.